Welcome to CSI Chat, where every topic's fair game. From finance to mysteries, we'll never be the same. Our hosts an accountant with a knack for a joke. We'll dive into the details and laugh until we choke. CSI Chat, where the numbers beat the fun. We'll explore every subject under the sun.
Okay, well, we are really lucky today to be joined by Peter Doherty. I'm going to give a little bit of background on Peter before we get started here. But the topic of conversation really today is how to protect yourself when you're traveling abroad, whether that be from a personal perspective or from a business perspective. And Peter's going to give us some really good tips and thoughts on how best to do that. So I'm first going to go through Pete's background, which is beyond impressive. There's a reason why he does what he does. But Pete has worked at the London Metropolitan Police Service for over 25 years, focusing on major crime investigations, including organized crime groups, and was a part of the hostage crisis negotiation unit. And Pete is currently the head of crisis response at SRM, which is a global intelligence and cybersecurity consultancy. So he moved on from the London Metropolitan Police into kind of private practice, helping individuals and companies across the globe protect themselves. So, Pete, thank you very much for joining us today. We very much appreciate you taking the time.
You're welcome. It's great to be here.
So maybe just talk a little bit about. Let's roll the clock back to the very beginning. Pete, is you chose a career path in terms of being a police officer and working in the London Metropolitan Police Service. Give us some perspective on the early days of Pete Doherty and why did you want to be a police officer to start things off?
It's a great question. I guess a lot of people should probably say, I wanted to be a police officer from a very early age, and I followed my wishes and desires. And actually, that didn't happen in my case. So I was originally grew up in Northern Ireland, and that was, back in the late 70s, early 80s, and that came with its own certain dynamic, as you can imagine, back in the day. By the time I'd left school, I was an engineer for, I think it was about 5 years. And when I got to sort of about year 4, year 5, I thought, I want to do something else, something a little bit different. So I looked at potentially joining law enforcement, potentially joining the military. I also thought about engineering jobs in the Middle East, thought about going out into the oil rigs and things like that as well. So it was really just changing that type of work that I did. And I knew there was something, sort of maybe another calling really that I wanted to get involved in. So I applied for all of the jobs that I thought were relevant, that I think I wanted to do. And I kind of thought the first one that comes up, well, we'll give it a shot and see what happens. I know that I didn't want to be a police officer in Northern Ireland only because it had a certain dynamic with it. And I thought London, the Metropolitan Police had, it was a bigger city to operate in. They didn't have a specific terrorism element, albeit they still had many different varied threats, including terrorism there. But I think there was more opportunity in terms of skill set policing and learning the trade, really. So policing's the first job that came up, and I thought, okay, let's give that a go and see what it looks like. I had already been in the UK for a year, so in mainland England for a year by the time that had happened. And all of a sudden, 30 years went by, and there I was, I had sort of started at the very bottom. And I say the bottom, it's a really important job. I started off as a patrolling brand new police officer out on the street, learning your trade, dealing with, whatever you came across. And then very quickly sort of got, it morphed into getting into the detective world and then specializing within the detective world. So I spent, by the time I did the full 30 years, I had ended up in counterterrorism, homicide, serious organized crime, hostage negotiation, dealing with serious sexual assault. So pretty much everything you could possibly think of. And I guess to sort of bring me to where I am now, not only was it how you managed to deal with something from a tactics perspective, from a strategic perspective, but also the thing that ran through everything was communication. So I find that I was pretty good at, getting witnesses to give a good full account of potentially what they'd seen or what they'd gone through. I was pretty good at getting witnesses to provide that evidence, even if they were maybe a little bit reluctant at the start. So giving them that reassurance that they needed. Then I kind of went beyond that. I realized that when I was interviewing both witnesses and then suspects, that I sort of had this ability to get people to maybe say a little bit more than they initially wanted to. And again, that was really about being fair to everyone, giving their account of the events, whether they're a witness or a suspect. That then, again, you're talking about a period of years where you're using these skills, negotiation skills, I guess. And that then culminated all the way up towards the end of my career, when I was involved in hostage negotiation. And that was dealing with domestic kidnaps, criminally inspired kidnaps, but also dealing with terrorist-inspired kidnaps, which are a much more counterintuitive type incident to deal with, looking at options and recommendations and negotiation strategy. And we were providing that for HMG, for Her Majesty's Government, for the Prime Minister of the day. And that's going back to sort of 2014 to 2015, working very closely as well with our colleagues over in the RCMP and the FBI and other parts of Europe as well. So, and that was everything. That was everything from suicide intervention to sieges to barricades to kidnaps to terrorist-inspired hostage taking. Really, so it was an interesting 30 years, and one evolution just led to another throughout those 30 years, really, and in the blink of an eye, it was where we are. And generally in the UK, you do 30 years in policing. You can stay on if you want to, but normally people, if they do the whole thing, they do about 30 years, and then they look for something else. Some people just retire at that point, say they've had enough, and I certainly don't blame them either. That's for sure.
Absolutely.
But I was very fortunate. I saw that opportunity, particularly from all of the skills I'd got from all of those specialist areas of policing. And then lastly, that hostage negotiation stuff just elevated and was a sort of seamless journey into the corporate world. And I've been doing that. I'm just starting year 10 now on that side of things.
I didn't realize you're from Northern Ireland. I watched a documentary recently, Say Nothing.
Yeah, it's good. I watched
Oh,
that.
it's if people out there, if you want to watch a really good doc, this is one of the best documentaries I have ever seen. Is Say Nothing, because I didn't really know a lot of the background of Northern Ireland and the challenges that they were encompassing. And I'm just you mentioned Northern Ireland, and it's kind of ironic to some degree that you ended up in kidnap and ransom negotiations and things like that. And do you think that is part of your upbringing, that it kind of got you into that? Because I can just imagine growing up in Northern Ireland during that time would be quite challenging, quite an interesting as it's. And I don't know, maybe you'd say, well, in the doc, if you've seen it, that Say Nothing, that maybe they've taken, maybe they've made things a little bit bigger than they actually were. But what was it like growing up in Northern Ireland at that time? And do you think it actually influenced your future choices in your career?
Yeah, potentially. Actually, it influenced the choices in career. It was a very unique time, as you can imagine. Very well referred to as the Troubles, and of course, it was a lot more than the Troubles. It was, it was verging on civil war for the best part of
Absolutely
30 years. And what we didn't have in Northern Ireland at that time, I'm not sure we even have it now, but we didn't have it then, was racism. But we had sectarianism, which was just a different form of the same thing. So that, that was always present. The potential for being in the wrong place at the wrong time in terms of shootings or explosions or bombings or whatever, obviously as well. I think what maybe made it an even you kind of don't think about it at the time because it's life at the time, but looking back at it, I think one of the things that made it even more complex is my parents were teachers, but my father was also in politics, and he had a senior role in politics as well. So that heightened the sort of threat towards the household in one format, and obviously my role in policing elevated that threat in another area. So it was pretty interesting times. I guess you learn a lot about working and operating generally. And then obviously coming over to London was a different dynamic again. You obviously had all of the, you still had terrorism of various different types at that time. But you had all of the other organized crime and all the other threats from all around the world that a big city will attract. And I'm sure, certainly in North America, you could probably replicate that in most big cities as well.
Absolutely. So were you in London when they did the car bombing? When they bombed those cars in London and tried to get back to Northern Ireland, like, were you in London at that time, or was that sort of before your time of going to? Because again, the choice of going to the London Police Service, that's also like a really kind of interesting choice, right? It's going from Northern Ireland
Yeah.
into the London Police Service. I can imagine that might have been a conversation with the family as well, right?
That was kind of just before my time, but I remember there was at one point there was a ceasefire in London between obviously Irish terrorism and the UK government, and I was in some guy's house. We'd gone there on official business as police officers. I think we were doing a drug search or something like that, and while we were engaged in the search, I heard this massive bomb. Well, I obviously knew what a bomb sounded like from where I grew up. And I thought, wow, that was a big explosion. So we put the news on straight away. So all of a sudden, the hostility between a homeowner who's got police officers at his house and they're searching for drugs. Now we're all sitting on his settee and we're watching the TV. And the sort of search procedure went right out the window. And I recall actually calling over to home, as my dad obviously is a politician, and said, I think you'll find the ceasefire has completed. And I must have been the first person actually to notify them in Northern Ireland in that respect. So strange times, really. But then all sorts of different risks have emerged, since those days over the last 30 years in London, clearly.
So you do 30 years in the London Metropolitan Police, and then, like you're saying, at that point, for the most part, it's a time to move on. So why did you choose to go to SRM then and specialize kind of in hostage and terrorism negotiations? What was the draw towards SRM?
Yeah, really good question. So around about 2014, 2015, maybe a little bit earlier, we were working as police officers, as representing Her Majesty's government, representing our Foreign and Commonwealth Office on terrorist-inspired kidnappings. We were working with organizations in the commercial world, in the private sector. And, these are organizations who are now, in effect, my competitors. We know lots of individuals, have worked with them, trained with them, know what they do and how they do it. And I think I find myself out in a couple of places in the Middle East around about 2014, 15. And I was dealing with a couple of British nationals at that time. The commercial world was there at the same time, and the sort of two worlds collided, but they were complementary for each other. Clearly, we all had our own red lines. But we did what we did at that time, and he can't really go into much more detail than that. However, I think by the time I was coming up towards these ones, around about 2016, the opportunity arose, I guess, stars aligned, all of those sort of usual cliches, where SRM were founding a new team in the insurance market for response to crises. So that could be everything. I mean, we respond to 75 different crisis types around the
Wow.
world to, all time zones, all industries, all types of clients. And this opportunity was being developed for SRM. My name was one of the ones that came up as, being someone to approach. And we were in a really fortunate position because at that time we had our pick of what we called the market, i.e. all of the individuals who were doing that type of response work. We could approach the best in the market that
Yeah.
we got at that time to put our team together. And that's what we did. And there's 20 of us based across the world in the Americas, EMEA, Asia Pac, and we're at 50-50 split between ex-special forces military and ex-specialist law enforcement. So,
Wow.
and that's what we've been doing. We're never complacent, but that's what we've been doing successfully for the last 9.5 years with SRM.
So give us some perspective then, Pete, on the state of state of affairs within our global environment. You might have some people out there thinking, again, if you're lucky enough, frankly, to be living in some of these countries like Canada, the UK, United States, the risk level on those, at least, generally speaking, is probably quite low. And maybe they say, well, you know what, when I travel, I don't really have to be concerned because of the environment that I typically operate in. But give us your perspective. You would have seen the worst of the worst, frankly. Give us your perspective on the state of global affairs as we sit here today, and the risk of travel. What do you give us just your overview of the kind of the lay of the land in 2025?
Yeah. So I think if you look at the sort of big geopolitical things, you've got, the China-Taiwan issue, you've got the Russia-Ukraine issue, you've actually really got the Russia-Europe issue now as well. That's being reported quite a bit in terms of what may or may not happen. You've got various axes, as it were, agreements between countries as you watch them align to, one set of values or rules or dominance or autocracy, whatever you want to call it. And that's the big picture that will rumble on. Beyond that, and sort of maybe getting a little bit more regional, we've always got those countries that I call the usual suspects. And that can be as well because of size. It can be because of the absence of maybe law and order as much as the countries you've just mentioned, such as the UK, US, Canada, etc. But where are we most often responding to, anything sub-Saharan Africa, even above that, where, responding to various detention cases, we respond to kidnaps, evacuation requirements, lots and lots of that in the Middle East. Clearly, we all saw that play out, several times over the last couple of years. Latin America will always be, will always have problematic areas. We see, response in Mexico, in Venezuela, in Peru, in Ecuador. Some of the, again, as I say, the usual suspects really. South Africa can be another country that can have, a fair bit of kidnap, extortion, threat. In terms of mainland US, we really see more threat cases there, as opposed to kidnaps and extortions and blackmails and things like that. They're more direct threat cases. Canada has probably been somewhere that hasn't been massively on our radar. So that's, I guess, good news in that respect. But I think one of the things since the pandemic, so everything closed down after the pandemic, the bad guys and bad girls didn't take a day off. I can assure you, they diversified and things. What then happened after that is, I think a lot of companies realized that they weren't match fit in terms of crisis management, planning, training, exercising, and response. So they elevated their training requirements and their approach to travel. Because the other thing was, people had been locked up for 4 years during the pandemic, so they couldn't wait to get out and travel again.
Yep.
So your guard goes down a little bit, and then the other bit is complacency. If you've been somewhere for a long time working and operating there, you get complacent, and that's always a danger. That's always something that you should constantly reevaluate.
And those countries that you mentioned, some of the hot spots, is it a matter of, look, there's certainly safe places to go and unsafe places to go, or is it more that, like you really need to be concerned going to there because really the risk is all over the place.
Yeah.
Which one would you lean towards?
I think it varies. And this is a really important point, actually. It's about keeping a constant vigil in terms of where you're traveling to and what it might be like when you get there. So Mexico is a great example. Mexico is a very big country. There's lots of places to go to, like other countries, that are great for a vacation, great for holidays and everything else. There are other parts, and I only pick out Mexico as an example. I'm not being disingenuous to them. This is, simply as an example. But there are other parts of that country where you just can't even travel there. You just can't even go there because it's so dominated by the cartels. The same could be said for other countries in Africa. The same could be said for, some parts of the Middle East. They're just slightly more dangerous, and some are a lot more dangerous. So the advice that I always give to people is, bear in mind, we had something like, in the last couple of years, there was something like 67 elections going on around the world. My advice to people is do your due diligence on wherever it is you're traveling to. And don't forget that the country that you booked to go to today might be a very different country that you arrive in 3 months' time when you actually get there. And there's all sorts of things like natural disasters, civil unrest, and any other myriad of issues which you could face, which some can be anticipated and some not. So that's the important thing. What I'd say to all travelers, whether you're corporate or not, is have a plan. So you must think about where you're traveling to, where you're staying, what you're going to do when you get there, who's going to move you around, what is a reliable mode of transport, what isn't. It's literally everything from the point that you arrive in the airport, what to expect, and how you manage your travel from there on. Airports around the world, some are very easy to work with, some are very safe. Other airports around the world, if you arrive as a new traveler and you haven't planned what it is you're doing, you haven't got someone to pick you up, you haven't got a trusted provider, you're very vulnerable. And that vulnerability is seized upon by criminals who are at the airport just waiting for someone who is naive enough to say, hey, I'm going to get to the airport and I'm going to call a cab. And, the cab will take me to the hotel. It's not as simple as that. In some parts of the world, you got to be a lot more careful. Because you just can't use public transport. It's that simple.
And where do you get your data from? Like obviously the internet is full of information that's out there. Not everybody, is going to have access to, a Peter Doherty, obviously, to, obviously your friends and family probably call you up, Pete, and say, hey, like, what do I need to be aware of? Not many people are going to have that level of access. So for the average person out there that says, hey, I'm going down to Mexico for a conference or something, what's your advice on how do they get data in order to do exactly what you're saying and to kind of map out each step along the way?
So from an SRM perspective, we have an interactive platform called Global Security Insight, and that deals with just under 200 regions, and it looks at political and country risk for travelers. So it categorizes the various regions into, red, amber, green, for instance. So where the hot zones are, where the less dangerous places are, and it will highlight the likelihood of various different types of threats, everything from kidnaps to extortion to theft to robbery to everything else. And you can get a good idea of what it is you might be facing. If you haven't got access to that, what I would do is I would look at the country that you're traveling to. I then look at the city you're going to arrive in. I then look at the hotel and the street and everything else that you're going to arrive in and do your research on that. Get on the internet, do as much, if you haven't got access to any other sort of search engines, do as much Google, search as you can. Then what I'd look at is a number of countries who normally provide travel advice to their nationality. So you could look at, Canada, the US, UK, and pick another one, pick an outlier as well, i.e. a country who is potentially in the region not
Hmm.
necessarily the country itself, but in the region, look at their travel advice, look at what they're saying, and whether it's all but essential travel or no travel or whatever that might look like, and then triangulate it. So let's say, what are the US government saying? What's the UK government saying? What's the Australian government saying? And what's a neighboring country saying? And you'll start to get a really good feel for, okay, this seems to be a general theme. This seems to be something that I need to look out for. Obviously, the what you're Googling for is news articles and reports. And you really want to try and be able to do that across, if you can, to do it across all languages and do it across all mainstream media and social media, because that is helpful. Easier said than done, of course. So you're really doing a sort of horizon scanning um, exercise. Now, this is going into it obviously in a lot of detail if you're able to do that, but it'll give you a good feel for where you should be going and what you should be looking out for and where you shouldn't be going, more importantly. Governments who put together travel advice, I think the thing to remember is they'll be providing travel advice on, go, don't go, all but essential travel, or leave now.
Yeah.
And they won't necessarily tell you why that is, but you can guarantee that some of that information is potentially as a result of sensitive intelligence. Therefore, if they're providing you that advice, it's going to be pretty accurate. It's going to be pretty good. I often see people who will sometimes look at that kind of free, high level, government sponsored advice and say, oh, it's a little bit of, overkill. I don't think it is. It's there for a reason. And,
Yeah.
As with all of these places, it's something that we find a lot in evacuation. You don't want to be in a position where you've gone into a country against advice. It has gone wrong for you, and the window of opportunity is now diminished and you're unable to get out again. That's an uncomfortable position to be in, and, something that should be advised not to do, clearly.
And give us some perspective. Obviously, like you say, when you go into these countries, a lot of different things that can happen. You could get robbed. You could get assaulted or something along those lines. And obviously the most extreme. Well, maybe you'll tell me this isn't the most extreme, but maybe one of the worst things that can happen is a kidnap and ransom situation. So give us some perspective, Pete, on who are the bad guys out there when we travel into these countries, and there's folks out there who want to, take advantage of us and potentially hurt us and potentially, do God knows what to us. Who are these people and what is their motivation at the end of the day?
Yeah. I guess we're going to fall into a couple of different categories. Let's deal with the politically motivated stuff first of all. So that's terrorist inspired. What do they want? Chances are they may actually ask for a financial concession, so a ransom. Now, clearly, with various G8 agreements, Terrorism Act, United Nations Security Council resolutions, etc., that becomes very problematic because it's highly against the law to pay a ransom to a terrorist organization. Normally, those types of kidnappings are politically motivated. So regardless of the fact that a financial concession has been requested, that will also be because they are seeking potential legitimacy to be identified as a legitimate organization. They'll be seeking potentially change of a government's policy, possibly an exchange of prisoners, and potentially anything else where a terrorist group can benefit. So that's that is in its extreme, and that's what their objectives will be. And anybody that they feel that will help that aim and help to bring them into the public eye and help to support whatever their narrative is, whatever their aims and objectives and goals are, they'll do that. Then we get into the criminal groups, and there's all sorts of different criminal groups who operate in completely different ways all around the world. They'll all have different MOs, they'll all have different expectations. But ultimately, you will have an organized crime group. So they're going to be, they're going to really be thinking about what they're doing. They're going to be well organized. They'll be ruthless. they'll be effective, they'll know what they're doing, and they'll certainly know how to target an individual, get the sufficient intelligence that they need to be able to successfully kidnap that individual, and then thus starts the the process of kidnapping, etc. And they're normally well organized because they want a high net worth target, because they want a big payday. So that's why they're going to, that's why they're going to go to all of the efforts and energy that they do. Then we've got maybe the more less organized group. So they might not have the same resources. Therefore, they may not also have the same aspirations and demands. So they may be looking for a smaller payday and indeed in a quicker period of time as well. And ultimately with kidnaps, where, I know this sounds a little bit counterintuitive, but we're all on the same side, i.e. kidnappers are trying to sell something, i.e. a human being. And, the organizations, families, etc., are trying to buy that, that commodity, that human being. And then I think lastly, you have the option, the opportunistic stuff where you've just got criminals at, whatever level, low level. They see someone in the country who looks a bit different, dresses a bit different. There will be a perception of wealth, and there'll be an opportunity which might have arisen, and they think, okay, this is a great chance. We'll bundle this person off into a car, and away we go. And that's where the complacency thing comes in again. So by being in the wrong place at the wrong time and not having considered where you are, maybe standing out in the middle of the street, waiting for, to try and hail a taxi when you just shouldn't be doing in that part of the world. Maybe, having had a couple of drinks too many, so you're not really aware of what's happening around you. Secondly, you might not be aware of what's happening around you if people are speaking in a different language. So they can actually be talking about doing something to you and you don't really know what they're saying, even though they're in earshot. So that's the more opportunistic stuff, which does happen as well. Any one of those examples isn't a pleasant experience, whatever they are. So, again, to be avoided at all costs.
And, when you talk to the folks who were victims, when you talk to them, they come back home, like are most of them like kind of saying like, I never would have thought this would happen to me. Like, is that kind of the overriding principle, is that if you don't think it could happen to you, just talk to Pete Doherty and Pete will give you a different perspective, because you probably see this on a daily basis.
Yeah, I think I think people are just very relieved to get home. That's the first thing. They very rarely know what's actually happening on the outside. The kidnappers will only use them as leverage. They'll probably, again, to keep them, subdued, as it were. They'll be saying, well, nobody really cares about you. And yeah, they're not really going to offer any money for you. And they'll be looking at other avenues, other areas that the victim will provide them with, where they could potentially open up another line of communication and try almost to be negotiating with three different elements to get a ransom from each. But ultimately, very rarely, thankfully, are victims asked to self-negotiate their own release. That's really bad news. They should never do that. They'll be held in captivity. In general terms, most people are provided with sufficient life support, i.e. food and water, because obviously they are a valuable commodity to the kidnappers. They want to keep them alive. That includes vital medication as well, because clearly some people will get kidnapped. And, we've seen people getting kidnapped at 70, 75 years old, and they haven't got a month's worth of medication on their bag because they were only out for a couple of hours. So all of these things are really, really critical to ensure that someone is kept alive. But kidnappers, professional kidnappers, are cognizant of that, and they will go, some way to ensuring that those things are all present. That said, they'll obviously leverage, that position as they go along, no doubt.
The other thing I've learned through talking to folks like yourself, Pete, is they would tell me that, some of these folks, especially in organized crime, are highly, highly intelligent. Like, these are not, stupid people. These, a lot of this stuff is highly planned out, highly thought of. And are you in the same boat? Is that, again, these are not stupid people who are doing this. These are highly intelligent, and they know exactly what they're doing.
Absolutely. This is their business model. This
Yeah.
is what they do. And if you, I mean, disregard them at your peril, because, they know what they're doing. They know how to do it, and they are ruthless. They're narcissistic. And I think when you get to managing any type of direct threat to an individual, you can't get it wrong. There's no margin for error, because if there is, if you make an error, at best, the individual in captivity or under threat will be hurt or injured, and at worst, they'll have their life taken.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think you just absolutely have to assume that these people are very intelligent and very clever and know what they're doing.
And in terms of motivation, you talked about the political one up, the first one, as being, one of the focus areas. But for most of the others, is it ultimately just cash? Is that really
Yeah.
what, like you say, this is just a buy and a sale of a human being? Is that if you meet their price, and the cash is X amount, like ultimately that's what these folks are after at the end of the day, is just cold hard cash?
That's pretty much it. There's maybe an odd occasion where the concession might be a property. There might be a very, very odd occasion where there's a slight grievance involved there as well. And we've seen that before, particularly in one kidnap we dealt with a couple of years ago, where, and thankfully this is very rare, where a family had their 4 children kidnapped on their way to school, and the kids were kept for a month.
Wow.
So not only was that a kidnap and leverage against that particular family, but actually it was a very personal message as well from the kidnappers to that individual, to that family member. There are other people that you could take, that you could leverage, such as friends, family, other adult relatives, but they decided on the children. So that's the reality of it. But yes, it is 99 times out of 100, it is cold hard cash is what the kidnappers are after.
And do they have any sympathy? Like you said, if you're out there traveling on vacation with your wife and your 2 kids, and you run into a situation, or would they say, "Hey, the wife and the kids can go. I'll just take just take the one," or is it just now, "Hey, we're they just want to maximize their return, and we'll take everybody."
Yeah, they'll take everybody, because
Wow.
that's the biggest leverage. Bear in mind, okay, they've got to provide life support for everyone, but they will take everyone. The only time really that they will release someone early is if they think it's to their benefit, i.e., one, to get the message across that this is the ransom demand, etc., or if they think that individual will be significant in being able to make it happen. But generally speaking, no, they'll just keep everyone.
Got it. So you've touched a little bit about risk assessment. So let's assume you have somebody out there who's planning to go to one of these countries, and like you say, is going to Google as much as they can to figure out their routes and things along those lines. So that's obviously step one. But what are some other suggestions for people to do in terms of, maybe having emergency contact numbers, thinking about what they're bringing, does it make sense to bring,
Yeah.
expensive clothing and things? Maybe
Yeah.
over and above Googling and really trying to map out your route and
Mhm.
trying to identify, the risk areas. What are some other, good suggestions on things that you should do to prepare before you actually go?
Yeah. So, long before you get so part of the planning thing, first of all, let's start with that. So you've done all the Googling, you've done all the research. So you hopefully now have identified a secure hotel in a secure or less dodgy part of town, put it that way. And you're going to be arriving at the airport. So when you get off the aircraft, again, if it's somewhere that's, that needs a little bit more thought, you're going to want to have an arrangement already in place with a trusted provider who's going to take you in a cab or a taxi to the actual hotel itself. What's really good practice, unless you know the cab driver personally, is to share a a PIN number with them, like a 4-digit PIN number with the cab driver. So the guy that's holding your name up, you walk up to them, we all do it. You walk up to them and go, oh yeah, Mr. Doherty, that's it. Great, fantastic. And you wander off with this total stranger and get in their car. Well, what happens in some parts of the world is the people who are doing that, the legitimate people who are doing that, are spotted by the criminals. The criminals write the same name on a piece of card, but they walk further up the queue to make sure that you see them before you see the real person. So that's why you want the PIN number, so you know that that is the legitimate individual. Then you want to know that, what is the route? Where am I going? So what should I expect to see when I get in this cab? Should I expect to see green trees and fields, or should I expect to see, a highway? Should I expect to see a built-up area? And within what period of time should I expect to start to see high-rise buildings and the city that I'm supposed to arrive in? So, if you think, well, this is 25 minutes down the road, if all of a sudden you're still at 45 minutes and you're still looking at trees, that there's something seriously wrong. Once you get into, wherever it is you're staying, we all have to provide some information, obviously, to reception. Don't overshare any information that you don't need to. I would certainly say to people, let's say if they're going to visit somewhere in Mexico, first thing to do is unplug your phone in the hotel, in your room, because you can pretty much guarantee there'll be various types of extortion attempts and other threats that you might receive on that phone. And they're very good at it. They're very good at getting people to believe they're an imminent threat and make payments. And we could probably spend 2 hours just talking about that alone.
So they're calling you on your hotel phone doing that?
Oh, you're on your hotel phone. It'll be a
Wow.
criminal ringing you from prison. And he will make you believe that there's a cartel downstairs on the way to your room.
Wow.
Because they believe you're someone else and they're on their way to kill you. And it's now your job to convince that person that you're not who they think you are. And during that time, during that convincing, as it were, that they will get sufficient information from you, including images, that they will then use to put to someone else and make it look as though you've been kidnapped. It's called a virtual kidnapping. So,
Wow.
but you haven't. And they're very good at it. They know what they're doing. But anyway, so you get to your hotel, just, be as limited as possible on the information that you provide. Clearly, the people who work in the hotel, etc., they're great sources of ground truth. They're going to tell you, where the good restaurants are, where you should go, not go, etc. But you do need to know where you're going in daylight hours and where you're going in darkness, and environments can change really quickly. We always say, depending again on where you're actually traveling to, if it's a higher risk area, you should always have a go bag ready. So that should be something that you can pick up in the middle of the night and just leave the room immediately. It should have your passport, medication, change of clothes, maybe a little bit of food, some water, things like that. Potentially you've got a wedge in the door. So one of the great things that you could take along with you on any type of travel is a door stop. And most hotel room doors open inwards. So it's a good idea to have a door wedge, and it will give you the extra few minutes, seconds, or whatever you need if someone is trying to force their way into your room. Or it might be enough to get them to distract them and to go elsewhere. We normally talk about not staying any higher than the 4th floor. Depending on where you're going, don't stay in the front of the hotel. We've seen all sorts around the world of, vehicle-borne explosive devices if you're out in Pakistan and places like that some years ago. So we don't want to stay at the front. And then at the back, we say don't go above the 4th floor. And that's generally because that's pretty much where the fire engine can get its ladder to before it's struggling. So if there's a fire in the hotel, you don't want to be on the 29th floor, basically. Familiarize yourself with access, egress, whole emergency stuff. So when you get up in the middle of the night, if the lifts aren't working and there's a bit of a smoke-filled room, you kind of know where you're going. If you've got a buddy with you, great, because you're looking after each other. If you haven't, and it's a medium again to high risk area, you should be thinking about, okay, I'm going to call in to someone, whether it's a friend or relative or someone back at work, and say, hey, look, I'm going out to this meeting in the next 10 minutes. I should be back in 4 hours time. If I'm not, I'll let you know. So you just keep, a constant vigil on on your travelers so people know if they've missed a call in time, should they now be getting worried? Should they now be getting, alert? And should they now be thinking about potentially escalating it? And that's sort of how my company comes into play, where people think we're not quite sure what's wrong yet. They've missed a call-in point. It's out of character for them. It feels a bit wrong. It probably is wrong. So we're calling you guys now to get, on the front foot early, which is what we do. Then, you've got all of the various movement around the city or wherever it is you're going, thinking about the different venues that you might be meeting people in. But it's not just the risk or the foresight, as it were, in terms of crime and things like that you need to consider. You also need to think about cultural observances, religious observances as well, because, there's a lot of things that you can inadvertently get wrong with local nationals and attract attention to yourself where you don't really want to. Ostentatious, showing of wealth isn't a great idea either. So yes, you might be going out for a really important meeting, but, leave all your expensive jewelry and watches and things like that behind. Again, depending on where you are in the world, we always advocate having a false wallet, as it were, a false purse or whatever. And while you've got, your main credit cards and whatever it is you need for the evening, you've got this little false wallet with, 10, 20, 30 bucks in it. And if you are unfortunate and someone decides that they want to relieve you of that, you just take that wallet out, drop it on the ground. And as you're dropping it on the ground, you're stepping back and you're putting distance between you and that individual. They're pretty much going to lean down, pick that wallet up, and off they go, thinking that they've got whatever it is you had on them, you had on yourself for that evening. So it's a great way to diffuse a scenario without even having to think about it and try. Obviously, lots of different advice as well, but I guess if you're going into the Middle East or somewhere like that, do you want to stay near a government installation if at a time of heightened unrest? We saw that certainly around Lebanon and Israel and Jordan and places like that. Do you want to be taking photographs of installations, military installations, police cars, anything like that? You just got to think about what it is you're doing before you do it. And funny enough, I did a full travel briefing for a US-based client who was heading off to the Middle East. And they had lots of really interesting questions, actually, in terms of what should we expect, how should we conduct ourselves, and actually the work that they were doing as well. There was quite a lot of them going. And we spent a good couple of hours on a call going through all of those nuances, everything from where I stay to what I should be thinking about. There's countries in the world where things that we use every day legally are illegal when you arrive in country.
Yeah, well, we talk so far about kidnappers getting you, but do you run into a lot of issues? And I guess maybe the answer is yes, where you have people who took a picture of the wrong building and are arrested by authorities, and they're legally being held. Like the authorities are saying, like, look, Pete, I don't know what you want me to do here. We have laws. You can't take pictures of that stuff. And as the old saying goes, you go to Rome, you live like the Romans. You know what I mean? Like, you've got to be aware of the laws and the regulations. It's like the old, I don't know if you remember this. Well, we certainly remember North America. It happened when I was a kid. There's an American who went to Singapore and vandalized a car. Well, in North America, if you vandalize a car, you might get a bit of a slap on the wrist. Well, in Singapore, it was 10 lashes from some bamboo stick, and supposedly, on hit number 1, the skin was broken. Like this is no, like, but hey, you go to Singapore and, like you say, you got to be aware of the local laws and regulations.
That's very much it. And it goes back to that big word, complacency. Don't expect that something that is legal at home is legal overseas. Do your homework before you get there. I know one client who took holographic equipment, which is used for putting the holographs on credit cards and things, and they took that into Egypt and they were arrested straight away because it's illegal. Combat clothing is illegal to take into the country in Barbados. What's the other ones? at one point, I'm not sure if it's still true now, taking a plastic bag into Kenya was illegal.
Wow.
So these are all, registering as a foreign agent when you go to Russia. So you're not saying I'm registering as a spy. You're saying I'm registering as a foreign person, maybe representing a company, or an NGO or whatever that might be. And it literally is just, making a declaration. And the same as, for me in the UK, I'd have to have an ETA to go to Canada or an ESTA to go into the US. It's just as simple as that. But of course, entering without doing it, then you're detained. And is it part of their, constitutional legislation? Yes, it is. Sometimes legal detentions can quickly move into illegal detentions, but ultimately, the easiest win of all is don't get detained in the first instance. And some of, we deal with a lot of detentions, and to be quite frank, probably 90% of them could be avoided.
Yeah, well, there was even a situation you mentioned, detentions, is that, they had a prominent female basketball player who was
That's it.
playing in Russia and was
Yeah.
caught with, a small amount of, marijuana or whatever it may be, which again, on this side of the ocean is nothing. It's in
Yeah.
Canada, it's legal for Christ, but over there, all of a sudden you're locked in a jail cell and, and God knows when you're going to get released, right?
Yeah, that's right. And, get yourself into a bit of drug trafficking, on a minor scale. And then, certainly over here in the UK, worst case scenario, you might get a year or two imprisoned. Get yourself to the wrong country, maybe in Asia Pac somewhere, and all of a sudden you're facing the firing squad. So again, that's not a position you want to be in. So it is very much about, Rome and the Romans and respecting people's laws and cultures and religion. And I think if you do that and you do it wisely, you can have a great trip, actually. Because most of the countries I've ever been in, regardless of how dangerous they are, normally speaking, most of the people are, they're pretty nice. They're a delight to spend time with. And they're much, much more receptive to you if you give that observance to them and their culture and their religion and everything else.
The other one I want to ask you about is the use of Uber. That's something that's obviously, something that's been quite different now versus 25 years ago. 25 years ago, again, if you wanted to get around, it was a taxi, like you say, or a private taxi. But now with Uber, you've got an app. You've got some of these drivers that get reviewed on Uber. You know how many, or allegedly, how many, rides they've given. What's your view? And I'll bet you a huge number of folks internally here use Uber on a regular basis.
Yeah.
What's your 2 cents on Uber? Do you think that's a safe means to travel if, again, you do a little bit of diligence based on what's in the app, or if you have the view that, look, anybody can get their Uber license, you got to be just as concerned with an Uber driver as you are with, just putting your hand up to catch a cab? Where are you on the use of Uber and some
I'd
of
say
these
the
other,
latter.
like Lyft or whatever it may be?
I'd say the latter. So just because they're an Uber driver, so what? They'll have some degree of licensing and insurance, but does it mean that they are, they've been through a million driving tests and they're a competent driver? Does it mean they haven't got a criminal background that they have concealed or whatever? Potentially no. And I'm now, thinking about sort of some of the more prominent countries like, Canada, US, UK, etc. So yeah, you can get an Uber and, 95 times out of 100 that there won't be any issues, and it should be fairly okay because it's fairly mainstream. Although there are all those reports of particularly lone female travelers and things like that, where they've not had a good experience and they've gone through, an assault, I guess, of various degrees. Where it then changes is depending on what country you're in. So I can think of one perfect example, going down to South Africa. Forget it. Ubers, no. Taxis, no.
Wow.
Buses, no. Trains, no. So they're all a big no. You really want to now be dealing with either organizations who provide specific security and transport. So you've already, researched them before you get in country, or you're using someone that is recommended by the hotel that you're staying in. So that's the sort of next best thing. But getting on the Uber app, hailing a cab at the side of the road, that's a big no-no. And that won't end well either. So again, this should all be part of the due diligence that you do when you're actually traveling somewhere. It's down to everything. For instance, can I use my Can I use my credit card? How much money can I get out of a cash point? That's another one, actually. You can only get a certain amount of money out of cash points in some parts of the world. I think it was either Libya or Egypt. We had that issue with a client. And because they took out more money than they were actually entitled to, they were actually facing a money laundering issue, believe it or not. And this was all, and some of these rules and regs to us, you might think it's almost a little bit overkill, but it doesn't really matter. It's their rules and it's their regulations. So to be knowledgeable and understand what you need to do and have in place beforehand is just invaluable.
Yeah, well, you mentioned different rules, like even Australia. I was watching a documentary recently where, if you get caught trying to smuggle drugs in Australia, it's an automatic lifetime prison sentence, right? Like it's certainly not like they don't mess around over there. And they, the doc was about some American who crossed wires and was nearly facing a lifetime. Whereas in the U.S. he ultimately served prison time in the U.S. He was released after 7 years.
There's so many horror stories out there, but I think all of them really look at poor planning, poor preparation, and complacency when you're there as well. You don't have to get in. It's like any risk. Any risk can be mitigated as far as possible. And as long as you've gone through the steps of 1, mitigating the risk, 2, understanding what it is, and 3, trying to avoid it, then you're halfway there. But let's say if you go into a high risk country, if we were having a call and you're saying, right, Pete, I'm thinking of going to wherever, high risk country, what's your advice? So the first thing I'm probably going to say to you is it necessary to travel right now? And why? Because it's the most obvious mitigating factor. Do you need to go now? And why do you need to go now? Yeah, I need to go now. And this is why. Okay, fine. Well, let's start planning it from there then. And that's what we do.
So now let's take an individual. They travel to wherever, and they run into problems, and they're now in the they get kidnapped. Now, one of your best practice documents at SRM, you talk about the 3 stages of kidnapping being abduction, movement to a safe house, and captivity. Maybe let's just start at the first one, Pete, to give people some perspective on what would actually happen. Is walk us through that first stage of abduction, like what would happen, because this is the other thing too, like this is a high risk maneuver by these folks. Like this is not stealing your wallet or something like that, or stealing your car. This is a really risky maneuver, and presumably this has to be planned out to a T in order for this to go properly. Because like you say, if something happens and that person were to be injured, it's all for naught. You know what I mean? Like, so the planning of all this has to be laid out. So maybe just talk us through that first stage of the abduction. What happens during this stage?
So let's say it's a pre-planned event. Let's say you're not just standing outside a restaurant. You've been there for 30 minutes and you've drawn attention to yourself, and a couple of, local criminals have tried their luck to bundle you into the back of a car. Let's say it's a little bit more organized than that, which invariably it is. At that point, what you can be pretty assured of is this criminal group have probably been watching you for a series of days and weeks. They've probably been with you all day. You just didn't know they were there.
Wow.
So they're thinking they'll know your routine. They'll know what your movements are. They'll know where you're staying. Again, depending on circumstances, not only will they know where you work, they might know where you live as well. They'll know what routes you take. So they will look at the vulnerable point where they can manage to abduct you in the quickest and safest way for them, time possible. So it might be en route from A to B in a vehicle. And we see that quite often where, vehicles are ambushed, or it could be, someone's ambushed in the street. What you can be absolutely assured of is it's a bit like law enforcement as well, actually. When you put an attack in, as it were, when you are trying to achieve something quickly, it's about high dominance. And that's why you see cops, with their guns out and shouting and screaming, and it's very dominant. Well, kidnappers will be exactly the same, because they want you to comply immediately. They don't want to fist fight. They don't want to roll around on the pavement with you. They don't want you to resist. They want you to do whatever it is they want you to do. So it's very dominant. I think the other thing as well is, and we've had some people over, we've had some people over the years who've been exceptionally lucky, very fast thinkers and very fast runners. And at a point where they've been grabbed, they've literally pushed the barrel of a long rifle away and ran for it, and have been very lucky and have got away. 9 times out of 10, that won't happen. This is an extremely dangerous time during any kidnap, because kidnappers themselves are highly motivated. They'll be at their highest alertness possible at that particular time. They will be waiting for you to do something to try and escape. And they'll deal with that very dominantly and very hard. So it's a difficult time. The best advice, as counterintuitive as it is to submit, because, again, a good negotiation strategy and everything else should bring about your release once your company and your family or whatever it is gets involved and brings about your safe release. So although it's counterintuitive, that is probably, unless you really think there's not only a window of opportunity to escape, but you are 100% confident and competent that you can pull it off, and not many people can, because it'll take you by surprise. You'll be shocked. Before you know what's happening, it'll almost be over. So that's the first part of it.
Well, the other thing too is that, again, for the average person, like, you might be used to those situations and know how to deal with it. But for the average business person like myself, it's probably the first time in our life that we've ever encountered a situation like that. And like you say, we'll just be in shock, to try and think rationally because you can never prepare for a situation like that. Right.
No, you can't.
And you're complete. And the other thing too, like you say, these folks have been following you and have prepared for this exact moment. They know exactly what to do. And you're sitting there in complete shock and have never dealt with this. If it was me, I wouldn't know what to do.
Yeah. I think, if there's one thing to remember, it's just try to stay calm, follow instructions, and don't think that you're going to resolve it there and then on the pavement, during the attack. It's not going to get resolved then. It will get resolved further down the line. So the main thing is to stay safe, stay alive, stay calm, and, it'll be sorted out at a later stage. And it's hard to think about, but if you can remember anything from our conversation, that's probably the best advice that I would give. We've been dealing with these sort of cases for years, and as I say, we're never complacent, but we've got a good track record in helping companies and families to sort that out.
So they've been following you for weeks. They make their move. They put you in the back of a car. They've got you subdued. What's the next step? Where are the kidnappers now going to take you to move this process along? Because, again, sitting in the back of the car, I guess, is not going to help anybody. What's the next step of the process, that if you were in this situation, what would you expect in terms of, where am I going to end up next?
So they're going to take you to, hopefully, your final location firstly and foremost. If not, they might take you to another location and then move you again quite quickly. But ultimately, what do they want to do? They want to get you to their safe haven, what we would refer to as a stronghold. And that is where you will be looked after. That is where you'll stay. And there will be members of the kidnap team who will be responsible for feeding and watering and everything else with you. You'll be confined to a room. There'll be next to no opportunity to move around anywhere. You won't know where you are. You might see some individuals' faces. You might not. They might have balaclavas on or whatever. It doesn't really matter what they're wearing, even if they're, even if they haven't got masks on at that point because you're going to be staying with these people for days and weeks. So it's a good idea to be subservient. Certainly don't look people in the eye. Follow instructions. If you've got any strong views on religion or security, politics, keep them to yourself. It's not the time to have discussions, regardless of how complacent you might get. Don't offer information about yourself or your family that they potentially don't know already. But if they do allude to anything and say, you know, we're speaking to your wife or we're speaking to your husband and we know your kids will want you back at home. So they've been watching you. They know what your family setup is. At that point, then you can personalize yourself as well. You know, it doesn't matter. Of course, you can give them your name. You can talk about yourself, you know, so it's about personalizing yourself so that the kidnappers are more likely than not to see the human side of who they've got. That said, kidnap groups, they get the, you know, they get around that as well. You know, they think that any of their jailers, as they're called, are getting too familiar with people, then they'll just switch them out to someone else. So you're constantly dealing with that stranger. Your biggest enemy actually will be, as long as everything, you know, medical, food, water and everything, as long as that's taken care of, your biggest enemy will be time and how to spend that time. And, you know, you can imagine you will spend every hour of every day locked up in your own thoughts. There will be concerns, obviously, about your family and their welfare. There'll also be concerns about, well, how long is this going to take? What's happening on the outside world? What are they doing? You know, how's it all going? And the kidnappers won't tell you that. They're not going to give you that information. They're going to keep you informed with information that will keep you as subdued as possible. They don't want you trying to escape. They don't want you fighting. They don't want anything like that. So that's the hardest, I think, you know, having spoken to a lot of people who have gone through that ordeal, certainly some for months and years, that's been the biggest ordeal, how to fill their day, what to think about, what to do, you know. And we've, you know, heard all sorts of absolutely ingenious ways of people spending their time. You know, I've heard of one individual was decided to plan and draw up the plans in their head to build a house. And then they started, and they dug out the foundations and they started doing the building and, you know, and they literally built a bit of this house in their head every day. It's quite incredible. But it worked for them. It doesn't work for everyone, obviously.
Is there any other suggestions? Like, is it all about, you know, some sort of a mental exercise and trying to almost trick your brain into getting you out of these circumstances into perhaps like a better circumstance? Because like, again, you're just sitting there by yourself, right? Like at least in a jail, you know, presumably there'd be time to go out and exercise and, you know, and maybe watch TV and things like that. Like this presumably is a million times worse than jail, where if you're just sitting there staring at a wall for 24 hours a day, you know, that would be brutal.
Yeah, it is. And there's no other way to say it. You know, it's brutal. Clearly it just depends on the group that's taking you. It depends where you're being held, and it depends how, I mean, everything that they do for you will be to their advantage. So they're not going to do anything to be nice. If you've been there a long, long time, and I mean now months and years, you might get a very small concession of, you know, from kidnappers. Sometimes we've seen that before from the jailers. But it certainly doesn't mean they're your friends. It certainly doesn't mean that they would really hurt you if you tried to escape or something like that. But it is, you know, I think it's a case of trying to come to terms with where you are. There is the unknown. You don't know how long you're going to be there for, but as long as you're not being mistreated, as long as you're being fed, as long as you're being given life support, then, you know, that's the way to deal with it. Another sort of thing that a lot of people talk about is they try to almost compartmentalize their situation from their home life and their family. So they basically say, right, I'm not going to think about my family. I'm not going to think about home. I'm not going to think about my kids. I'm going to think about anything like that. I'm going to think about me in this room and these people who are here. And I'm going to keep my thoughts close to that. Plus, you know, whatever I think about during the day, which is easier said than done. And clearly everyone is different and everyone will have a different coping mechanism. But, you know, apart from being subservient, we always talk about trying to be the sort of gray man, as it were. So you don't want to be the noise. So you might not be taken along, or there might be other people who are being held with you. You don't want to be the person who says nothing, but you don't want to be the voice either. You just want to be this gray person in the middle who follows instructions, who isn't staring at the kidnappers and just, is easy to manage.
And now you mentioned, if you're captured in a group, so let's assume that there is a group of you there, 3, 4, I don't know, again, how many people would be typically held? What's your recommendation there? Should you talk with with the folks that you're with? Like, is there best practices for those, or like, what are your thoughts if it's kind of a group of you that get captured?
Yeah, I think, hey, look, it's got to make sense to be able to talk to each other, because imagine the amount of time you can spend talking about each other and, their lives and maybe the situation that they find themselves in. I think the big thing with kidnappers are, and then they already have, that's the first thing. So whatever environment you're in, whatever you're saying, even if sometimes they'll let you make the call to, to your loved ones to pass a message from them, whatever happens, you must always assume that kidnappers are listening. So even if you're in the room with 4 strangers on your own, just again, be cautious of the conversation that you're having. And again, be cautious about revealing any type of, sensitive information or general information that they may not be aware about you. Because you don't know who anyone is until the end, clearly.
And is there a way to think positive too that says, look, the motivation here is likely going to be money, and that hopefully this situation is going to be resolved in a few days, and this situation, like the situations where it drags on for months or years, or hopefully the exception and not the rule.
It's absolutely right. That is the way to look at it. This will be resolved. A compromise will be reached with both parties. A concession will be made, and you'll be released. And that's what will happen. All you have to do is just bide your time, try and be compliant, look after yourself, eat, drink, try to keep your mind occupied, and have that reassurance to know that the type of work that my team assists our clients with will bring about your safe release.
And what about local authorities? Like, just in terms of dealing with, dealing on the day to day on the ground, like are local authorities a resource that, you can use when, again, maybe you run into a problem or something like that? Or do you really have to be careful, trusting, let's say, because, in Canada, if I were to go and find somebody who was wearing a police uniform, I can, trust them, for the most part, I would like to think, in terms of trying to help me go where I need to go, or if I ask them a question. But would you say it's different in some of these higher risk countries, that where maybe some of the local authorities, you can't trust them in the same way?
Yeah, 100%. Again, if we're talking about those sort of Five Eye countries, or the ones, that we just mentioned, from my perspective, from our team's perspective, I mean, all of the advice and guidance we give to our clients is legal, it's ethical. We do push the boundaries to bring around successful conclusions. Clearly, we don't compete with law enforcement. We are ex-law enforcement, so we know the parameters. More than happy to work alongside any of the assets that they're able to bring to bring a successful conclusion as well. That said, we would always advise against rescue unless it's an absolute last resort, because it's such high risk. But generally speaking, the authorities in most established countries are quite happy to see, families, companies, speak to kidnappers direct and negotiate a settlement. So that kind of works quite well. When we go to some other parts of the world, it's a big no-no, because kidnappers are, they're potentially, law enforcement are potentially complicit, corrupt, and everything else. We've dealt with cases in Latin America where our victim has been released, and they're being released out of the holding pen, as it were, put in the back of a police vehicle and driven off to the dropping point. We've dealt with cases last year in Africa where, again, we know for a fact, an absolute fact, that, serving police officers who were involved as well at the time. So there's just no margin for error where you're dealing with corruption. And, we would just keep them at arm's length for that reason, because it's too unsafe not to do so.
And then maybe just talk a little bit as we wrap up here, Pete, about SRM and the, you touched on it a little bit during the discussion in terms of, you know, how you're helping companies. And you'd mentioned in COVID that things, kind of ramped up post COVID. But maybe just give some perspective on SRM and the training that you would provide to corporations. Like, what are some of the common areas that corporations are asking for help, or do you work with individuals directly as well in helping them? Just give us some perspective on, from a risk management perspective, how SRM sort of helps corporations and individuals kind of prepare for these risks that hopefully never come to fruition, but in some cases they do.
Yeah, great question. So if you imagine we deal with 40, sorry, start again. We deal with 75 different crisis types. That's
Wow.
everything from pandemic, epidemic, natural, man-made disaster, war, terrorism, active assailant, coup d'etat, just everything. And whilst responding to a crisis, you've got to have a framework that you can at least start to put in place to respond to that crisis properly. So how we support our clients in the initial stages is we'll have a look at their existing crisis plans. So for the purpose of what we're talking about at the moment, that might be a general crisis management plan. It might be a kidnap and extortion plan. It could be a travel journey management plan. Could be an evacuation plan. And then they're all different. They're all nuanced quite differently. And some of them are quite counterintuitive as well. So we'll review existing plans. We'll highlight at high level where they potentially need improvement. If a client hasn't got a plan in place, we'll help them write one bespoke to their operating environment, risk tolerance, all that type of thing. Then it's important to train your organization, your crisis team on their roles and responsibilities, so that when there is a crisis, everyone knows this is my role, this is what I've got to do, and it comes together really quickly. Looking at some of the key questions you might have to answer as well. So if it's a non-sanctioned, non-terrorist case, what's our company or family policy on payment of ransom? It doesn't have to be a black and white answer, but let's have the 3-hour debate on it now, rather than when the actual crisis hits itself. So we've got our plan, we've trained our staff on it. Then it's important to run simulated exercises to see what your strengths and weaknesses are. And that can be run, against any type of crisis type. And the way we do it with our clients is we make them bespoke to their operating environment. We have tabletop exercises, various injects, live calls with kidnappers, all that type of stuff. So they get a real feel for how they managed their response. What we don't do with our clients is we don't train them to failure. We'll take them through each part of the inject, then we'll stop, think about the decision making, have a little bit of a review on crisis management principles, and then move on to the next bit. And I think companies get an awful lot of value from that. It's probably the thing that companies and individuals have the least time to do is training and exercising. One, because it costs money. Two, it costs time and opportunity. And really what are businesses about? They're about earning money for the business that they do. So, the security thing, again, through some complacency, can take a bit of a backseat. And that can be just because, hey, look, we're busy. Everybody's busy in today's day and age. But it is invaluable. And that's the sort of stuff that we help our clients with. And then we can get into a whole raft of other things, strategic threat assessments and we do various horizon scanning that I was kind of alluding to. Lots of other in-depth security reviews, etc. So it's really whenever. No 2 days are the same, really. It just depends what the client needs to try and help them out.
Last question for you. If you
Sure.
look forward 5 to 10 years, Pete, do you see the risk of kidnap ransom going down? Like, do you see the issues going down, or do you just see this, with everything going on in the world today, it's just going to keep going up. It's just, there's no decline we're talking about here.
It's going to keep going. It's an age-old emotive crime. I think what are the two oldest crimes? Prostitution's one of them, I think, and potentially kidnap is another. Kidnap's been going on for time immemorial, and you've got all of these organized crime groups around the world and terrorism and everything else. Piracy. We've been dealing with piracy cases in Somalia and the Gulf of Guinea.
Yeah.
It's a good, lucrative business. And, these people know what they're doing. It's their business. That's what they run. You wouldn't shut your business down tomorrow, nor would anyone else. So they won't either. So it's going to keep going, sadly, but it is.
Yeah. No, it's a sad affair, is for sure. But Pete, thank you very much for joining us today. We very much appreciate your time. I would encourage anybody, if you want to learn more, check Pete out. He's on LinkedIn, and you can read a lot. Just Google SRM. You'll see all of their services and things like that. And yeah, if you're interested, definitely reach out to Pete. But thank you very much for taking the time, Pete. We very much appreciate it. And hopefully people have learned a little bit on how to stay safe when they're traveling.
Thank you very much, Scott. And thanks to everyone for listening to what I had to say.